Hello, IPEM friends. This has been a true, record-breaking endeavor, similar to putting a man on the moon, really. That's how you should see it. And that's not so much in terms of coming up with a candidate vaccine, but really doing everything from making the vaccine to testing it in the requisite number of patients, but also the huge Herculean effort to upscale the manufacturing, where of course also the governments have weighed in by making available large sums of money to quickly help upscale the production. But it has truly been a Herculean effort. Most of these vaccines actually originate from European inventions. So just to, for instance, consider the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, this stems from the German biotech company BioNTech. Also CureVac is also a German biotechnology company. The AstraZeneca vaccine is from an academic origin. It comes from the Oxford University. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine comes from Janssen vaccines in Leiden in the Netherlands. And so that shows you that Europe is a real force when it comes to inventing these novel biotech approaches. I think the only thing where Europe has been lacking is in terms of turning these inventions into commercial endeavors. And that's really, I think, where America is still leading. When I started in this industry, which was around 2000, around the time of the burst of the bubble, we really had to scramble to put even small rounds together to keep our existing companies properly financed. And that has instilled a huge discipline, I think, with us and other firms in Europe that are still around to really, as I said, focus on the need to haves. What is it that you really need to achieve with this money to really be able to allow the next raise at the next higher round? And this discipline, this sort of being frugal, I think that is currently working in our favor, because we still have this thinking ingrained in, if I invest this much at this valuation, how am I going to translate that into a healthy multiple? There's a lot of capital available to new initiatives in the US, which has really pushed up the prices, and not just of the assets, but also salaries, rents, everything in the US, especially the Boston area, has become expensive. So if you compare today the US to Europe, I think Europe, great science, still shortage of capital, valuations are lower, about like for like 40% lower. Cost of running companies in Europe is about 50% lower. In the US, there's more abundance of capital. So some of the rounds we've seen put together are A rounds of 200 million. I've even seen a 300 million A round. So I think that allows companies in the US to really build companies in the broadest sense and really fully exploit platforms. Our last fund, Forbion 4, which is the 2018 vintage, is showing a 100% plus net IRR. Our fund number 3, a 45% net IRR. And so I think, and we are not unique in that. I think we have a pretty good track record, but I think the whole industry as such has performed very well. Our approach is to, on the one hand side, create companies. So from our funds, we do about 1/3 company creation, and we typically like to do that close to home, because when we set up a company, some of the initial management functions can be filled by our own staff. And 2/3 is our best selection of the existing universe of promising biotech companies, mostly in Europe, and then taking these to the next value inflection point. The way we go about that is really do backward engineering. So if we identify an interesting opportunity and we want to finance them to the next value inflection point, which is typically the next clinical trial phase. We then turn to our friends in the large biotech and pharma community, and we solicit their feedback. We get this very detailed feedback, which allows us to really build the investment case in a way that we turn an potential exit risk into an operational execution risk, because we know what the company needs to show to become an attractive acquisition candidate. It takes, first of all, a very broad skill set, because it's a very knowledge-intensive industry. And you already mentioned a couple of aspects. So it's not just about selecting the most promising science. It's everything around that. Manufacturing knowledge, regulatory knowledge, how to really design the optimal clinical trial. It's networks. And you really need to be able to attract the right advisors, also key opinion leaders, as we call them. It's all of that. And that means that in order to be successful in this space, you really need to have a sizable team where you have all these skills represented. To have that sort of experience on the team allows you to make better choices in the selection of deals, and therefore a lower attrition rate. In the end, if you do it right, the risk reward for investing in biotech is quite skewed towards the reward part. Everyone is seeing the attractions of investing in this space. It doesn't really lend itself to typical buyout approaches, because most of the companies, even the later stage ones, are still cash burning development stage companies. And there are, of course, some opportunities to invest in the CDMO business, so the manufacturing parties that are specialized manufacturers that are experiencing very strong growth. In terms of our business, where the opportunity lies, and that is also pursued by some of these larger, more original buyout players, is to finance, for instance, these late stage clinical trials. One way to do that is to, for instance, strike a deal with Blackstone or Bain to ask them to finance this phase 3 in exchange for a buyback obligation, typically, or option. That's really where we meet. So we go more late stage with our growth fund, also looking to finance phase 3 trials or parts thereof in a syndicate. And I think I could also foresee that we work together. There are several reasons. I think first and foremost, they do recognize the potential in terms of this being the age of biotech. I think we now have many years as an industry of good performance to show for, both in the US and Europe. Performance in venture venture life sciences on par. So I think that's one, and that was lacking maybe some 10 years ago. So I think that's important. Secondly, I think the whole COVID crisis has raised the awareness of what our industry is capable of, and sort of the societal role, if you will, the impact element of investing in biotech. Our industry is by nature impactful, so it doesn't take a lot to explain that if you have a novel cancer therapy that reaches the market, that you will not only make your investors happy, but also many doctors and patients. And that aspect has also driven, I think, a lot of interest of recent. There are a lot of AI tools that are quite useful to deploy in the drug discovery development space, and increasing numbers of companies are in fact doing so. For investors, it also poses a bit of a challenge, because it requires in-depth knowledge of the AI sort of technology, tech side of things, as well as how this AI is translating into drug discovery and development. And there are not that many VCs, I think, currently that have all this knowledge in-house. It's definitely something on our radar and of many VCs, but it's still an evolving space, as is, I would say, another sort of intersection of more engineering and biotech, which is the systems biology space. It's a challenge that I think is in front of all of us, and that will be the next frontier in our industry, indeed.